Ever since I was a little boy, I always wanted to be a policeman. It started when I saw an old black and white photo of my dad and grandfather standing together when Dad joined the police force. My name is Eric Geiger, but everyone calls me Rick. When I was born, my older sister Beth, who was 2 at the time, had trouble with the long E sound, so she just called me Rick and it stuck. In the 4th grade, we had an assignment to write about what we wanted to be when we grew up, and then had to read it to the rest of the class. A lot of the guys wrote that they wanted to be cowboys or astronauts. Of course, I said I wanted to be a policeman. On the playground, at recess that day, Stanley McCormick started teasing me about being a policeman. He called my daddy a pig and I was a piglet. Oink, oink. Here, piggy, piggy. He kept yelling. I told him to stop, but he kept it up, yelling louder and louder. When he shoved me down, I got up and punched him in the face. He grabbed his bleeding nose and ran to the teachers crying. I got to sit in the principal's office until Mom came to school and picked me up. Once we were in the car, I told her what had happened, and all she said was that Dad would talk to me the next morning. Pop was working the 3 to 11 shift and had left before we got home. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, after breakfast, Dad asked me what had happened at school and I told him everything. Rick, I appreciate you sticking up for me, but I've been called a lot worse. I am a big boy and I can take care of myself. You shouldn't have hit Stanley for calling me names. But sometimes you have to defend yourself against bullies who hit you first. I am going to take you to school this morning, so get ready to go now. Just before I walked into my classroom, Stanley came up to me and said he was sorry for calling me names and shoving me. My sister saw everything that happened and told my mom and dad. They were not too happy with me, he said. My dad told me I had to come to school today and apologize to you. Extending his hand, he asked, "Can we be friends?" "Yes," I replied. "We have been best friends ever since that day." Now fast forward 8 years to a couple of days after graduation from high school. Stan was over at my house, and we were trying to figure out what we would do for the rest of the summer. Dad came home from work and had something for me. "Rick," he said, "the city is starting a police cadet program. I have an application in my briefcase if you're interested. You'll get paid and be given cadet uniforms if you are selected. If you do well when you are 21 years old, you can go to the police academy. Graduate from there, and you will be hired by the police department." "Boy, that sounds like a good deal, Dad," I said. "It sure does," echoed Stan. "Yep." Stan had come around to my way of thinking about a future career. "Can I get an application too?" he asked my father. "You sure can," Dad replied, taking another application from his briefcase. To make a long story short, we both filled out the application and gave them back to my dad. 10 days later, we found ourselves being tested both physically as well as psychologically, and then had a final interview by some senior officers of the police department. 2 days after all that happened, Dad came home with good news for both of us. We had made the cut, and now we're officially Fort Lauderdale police cadets. For the next few years, Stan and I learned a lot working as police cadets. When Stan and I reached our 21st birthdays, we were enrolled in the police academy. The training was intensive. In addition to the classroom, we received physical and more psychological training. We spent a lot of time on the pistol range, becoming more than just proficient with our weapons. Finally, after 16 weeks in the academy, graduation day came. I now have a photograph of my dad pinning my badge on me, just like Grandpa did with him so many years ago. 6 months after that photo was taken, Dad retired from the force. He and Mom moved to Pensacola, Florida, to be closer to my sister and her 2 little girls. Beth's husband, Pete, had been a pilot in the Navy and now was a civilian contractor working at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. My probationary period was for 6 months. I was paired up with an experienced officer to reinforce what I had been taught at the academy. Stan received the same treatment. 10 weeks before my 22nd birthday, I was on my own, with my own call sign Bravo 6 and assigned to patrol the north end of the beach. The North Beach Zone stretched from Sunrise Boulevard on the south, north to the city limits of Lauderdale by the sea, and from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to the Intercoastal Waterway on the west. It was a mix of residential neighborhoods, motels, hotels, and businesses. 6 months later, Bravo 6, 10 to 94, backup unit, Bravo 8, signal 38, domestic disturbance, 5555 North East 33rd Avenue. Bravo 8 on scene. Dispatch radioed me. 10 to 4, dispatch. Bravo 6, 10 to 51, en route. 10 to 52, ETA, 90 seconds. I answered. Domestic disturbances are tricky. You never know what you are going to walk into, so it's just good practice to call for backup before confronting the situation. Dispatch. Bravo 6, 10 to 97, on scene. I radioed as I pulled up behind Bravo 8 squad car. "What do you have?" I asked Stan McCormick, my longtime friend, whose call sign was Bravo 8. "This is Margaret Dickerson," Stan answered, nodding toward an obviously distressed woman standing beside him. "She told me that a former acquaintance of hers showed up about 20 minutes ago. He was drunk or strung out on drugs, so she didn't want to let him in the house." He pushed past her and produced a gun. When her daughter came into the room, he grabbed her and threw Mrs. Dickerson out. She ran to her neighbor and called us. "That's all I know right now," he finished. "Before he pushed me out, he said he was going to make my daughter a woman. You have to stop him. She's only 15 years old," Mrs. Dickerson cried to us. "Okay, calm down and wait here," I told her just as we heard a young girl screaming from inside the house. "There's no time to get a hostage negotiator here, Stan. You take the front and I'll go around back. Give me a minute before you go inside. Try and use that silver tongue of yours and see if you can defuse this," I told him. Going to the rear of the house, I found the screen door to the pool area unlocked and a sliding glass door to the kitchen open. Withdrawing my weapon and holding it down by the side of my leg, I entered the home. Moving toward the sound of voices, I slowly made my way to the front of the house. As I heard Stan starting to talk to the suspect, I entered the living room behind the suspect. I am no expert, but this guy was strung out big time. I didn't believe any amount of smooth talking by Stan was going to end this situation peacefully. The guy had torn the young girl's t-shirt and had her jeans halfway down when Stan started telling him to back off and put his gun down. All he did was grab the girl tighter in front of him and point his gun at Stan. He yelled for Stan to get the hell out, and there was nothing Stan could do to stop him. Once more, Stan told him to put the gun down. He fired and hit Stan in his upper right leg. I yelled at him, and, as he turned to face me, the girl managed to break away. He fired and hit me. The Kevlar vest did its job. I fired twice, hitting him in his chest, just left of dead center. He fell and I stepped over to him and kicked his gun away. Keying my radio, I yelled, "Dispatch. Bravo 6. Shots fired. Shots fired. Officer down. Officer down. Emergency medical required immediately this location. 10-4, Bravo 6. EMTs on the way." Dispatch replied. I dropped to my knees alongside Stan and looked for something to use as a compress to stop the bleeding from his leg. The young girl came over to me and handed me her torn t-shirt saying, "Use this." Then she left the room. In what seemed like hours, but was only a matter of minutes, the EMTs arrived and took over from me. I slumped back against the wall and watched as they administered to Stan. After stabilizing him, they placed him on a gurney and transported him to the hospital emergency room. Another EMT unit arrived, and one of them went over to the guy I shot. He felt for a pulse and then just looked up at me and shook his head. By now the whole place was flooded with cops, including Delta 5, my supervising sergeant. Before Sarge could ask me anything, the girl reappeared with a new t-shirt on and dropped to sit beside me. I put my arm around her and said, "You'll be okay. It's over now. He can't hurt you anymore." She looked up and said to my sergeant, "He saved me. After that guy shot the other policeman, this officer shot him. If he hadn't done so, I truly believe that scumsucker would have assaulted and then killed me." Putting both of her arms around my neck, she pulled me close and kissing me on my cheek, she whispered in my ear, "I'll never forget what you did for me, never. I promise I'll never forget you." Then she got up and left to go outside to her mother. "All right, Rick, what happened?" Sergeant Johnson asked me. I filled him on everything from the time I got on the scene to when he arrived. "How about you? Are you hurt?" he asked me. "Yeah, my chest hurts like hell," I replied. Calling for one of the EMTs still in the room, he told them to get me over to the emergency room. In the emergency room, the doctor removed my Kevlar vest and uniform shirt to examine my chest. The a-hole was using hollow points. The bullet mushroomed when it struck you. Thank God you were wearing your vest. You're going to have one hell of a bruise. We are going to x-ray your chest just to be sure you don't have any broken ribs. Other than that, ice it. I'll give you something for the pain before you leave. You should be fine in a few days," he said, patting me on the back as he left the examination room. As I was putting my shirt back on, Captain Wilson, the shift supervisor, entered the room. "How are you?" the captain asked me. "I'm okay, I guess." "What about Stan?" Officer McCormick." I asked him. "He's still in surgery, but I have been told he'll be all right. Tell me what went down." After filling him in on what transpired, he told me I would be placed on paid administrative leave while Internal Affairs, IA, investigated the incident. It's policy. There's no getting around it. Then he told me that I had to see the department psychologist to be sure I had no lingering effects from having killed a man. "You have nothing to worry about as far as IA is concerned. Everything points to a justifiable shooting." That's one nasty bruise you have got there. Use the 10 days leave to rest up. You did real good, son. Real good. After checking with the doctor once more, I left the emergency room and went to the floor where Stan's surgery was being conducted. I saw his wife, Kathy. Yes, Stan got married just after finishing at the academy, in the waiting room surrounded by her family and numerous other police officers. When she saw me, she got up and rushed over. "Oh, Rick," she said, "they told me that if you hadn't slowed the bleeding before the EMTs got there, he wouldn't have made it." "Thank you. Thank you. Are you hurt badly?" "No, it's just a bad bruise. I am fine," I responded. "Any more news about Stan?" One of the nurses came out and told me that the doctors were just finishing up with him and would be out to speak with me in a few more minutes. She replied, just as she finished telling me that a surgeon came over to her with a big smile on his face. "He's going to be fine, Mrs. McCormick. We're moving him to a recovery room, and you'll be able to see him shortly." With that good news, one of my fellow officers, Charlie Reynolds, came over and asked if I needed a ride home. I told him I would be ready to go in a few minutes. I wanted to say goodbye to Stan's wife before leaving. After Charlie dropped me at my apartment, I decided to call my father and tell him what happened. The phone rang and was picked up by Dad. "Hi, Pop. It's me, Rick. I have to tell you what happened today. I killed a man this afternoon." The next morning, there was no point in staying in bed any longer. Sleep just wouldn't happen. After talking to Dad for the better part of 2 hours last night, I just laid in bed reliving every moment of what had happened the previous afternoon. Did I make the right decision? Was there any other way I could have handled the situation? Did he have to die by my hand? Anybody who tells you they wouldn't have lost a minute's sleep over what I had done is either a liar or a psychopath. After taking a shower and shaving, I dressed and walked to the corner store for a cup of coffee and a newspaper. The Sun-Sentinel newspaper had an in-depth article of yesterday's events. The story had the facts pretty much correct. It did question whether the shooting was justifiable. However, that was answered after the reporter interviewed the mother and the daughter as to what had happened. The remainder of the article focused on Stan's injury. When I returned home, there was a message on my home phone to call Captain Wilson at headquarters right away. Picking up my cell phone from the counter, where I had left it the night before, I read an identical text message from the captain. Returning the call, he directed me to come and see him immediately. When I arrived at headquarters on West Broward Boulevard, I was met by a few of my fellow officers as I walked down the hallway to Captain Wilson's office. Many of them simply shook my hand and patted me on my shoulder. They didn't say anything to me, but their gestures spoke volumes of support. Arriving at the captain's office, I saw him look up from his desk and wave for me to come into the room. There was another man sitting with him in his office. "Officer Geiger, let me introduce you to Dr. Edwin Michaels. He is the psychologist the department uses in these situations. He wants to talk with you for a while today." So for the better part of the morning, the doctor and I sat and talked. Rather, I talked and he listened. When I had finished speaking, he looked up at me and said, "Officer Geiger, I heard nothing this morning that would indicate anything other than the normal, mentally healthy response to what occurred. I am clearing you to return to duty as soon as the internal affairs investigation is concluded." After shaking hands with Dr. Michaels, I left and drove to the hospital to see how Stan was doing. Walking into his room, I found Kathy sitting beside his bed talking with him. He was doing so well that he expected to be released from the hospital the next day. We visited for about an hour before I left. 10 days later, the internal affairs investigation was finished and, as Captain Wilson had predicted, the shooting was ruled justifiable. I was cleared to return to work. 6 months later, I had just transitioned from midnights to the day shift and my body was still adjusting to the new hours. My shift today was quiet, too quiet. One traffic stop and a backup to another unit on a DUI arrest. I was looking forward to some downtime at my apartment as I drove home. As I got out of my car in the parking lot, I heard screaming coming from the pool deck. Racing around to the pool area, I saw a woman holding a small puppy and frantically waving her free arm pointing to the bottom of the pool. "She can't swim. She can't swim." She screamed at me. I unfastened my gun belt, dropping it on the deck, and I dove into the pool. I retrieved a little girl from the water and brought her up to the side of pool. Checking for a pulse, I found one, but she wasn't breathing. Checking her airway to be sure she hadn't swallowed her tongue, I began resuscitation, being careful not to overinflate her tiny lungs. After 3 or 4 breaths, a wonderful thing happened. She vomited into my mouth. I got the remains of her lunch along with a large amount of water from the pool that she had swallowed. Then she began breathing on her own, and as I was placing her in the recovery position, the EMTs arrived. Relinquishing my responsibility for her, I moved away to let them work. Placing her on a gurney, with an oxygen mask over her mouth and nose, they left. The older woman thrust the puppy into my arms and left with them. Great. Here I am, soaking wet, holding a small mini dachshund puppy with no idea as to the identity of the woman. When Sam, one of the other residents, handed me my gun belt, I asked if he had any idea who the child and woman were. I think the kid is Darlene Sullivan's daughter, and the woman is her grandmother. Darlene and the little girl live in apartment 212, he told me. When I entered my apartment, I looked at the little dog and said, "Well, it looks like it's just you and me for a while, little fellow." I was rewarded with a big lick on my face. The first order was to get out of my wet uniform and into dry clothes. As I dried the puppy and removed his leash, I noticed a tag on his collar that identified him as Hans. "Okay, Hans, let's round up some dinner for both of us." After throwing a potato into the microwave, I retrieved a strip steak from the fridge and put it onto a grill pan on the gas range. All the while I was preparing dinner, Hans sat and looked at me, with his tail wagging in anticipation. Taking 2 plastic cereal bowls from the cupboard, I filled one with water and placed it on the floor. Then cutting up a raw carrot, I put it into the bowl, along with some pieces of my steak. When I sat down to my meal, I put the bowl on the floor next to the water dish. Hans was finished eating before I could manage to even start with mine. After eating, I cleaned up the kitchen and, reattaching his leash, Hans and I went for a walk. Half an hour later, after visiting every tree and signpost in the neighborhood, we returned. Sitting in my recliner in front of the TV, I began flipping through the cable channels to find something to watch. Funny, even with 200 or so channels, there was nothing that caught my interest. Then I remembered I had recorded Monday night's football game on my DVR. As I settled back to watch, Hans jumped up into my lap and promptly fell asleep. Halfway through the second quarter, I dozed off. Then the doorbell to my apartment rang. Hans raised his head, barked once, and settled back down asleep. Getting up and carrying the sleeping puppy, I went to see who was there. Outside was an older man and the woman I recognized from this afternoon. After inviting them inside, he said to me, "Hello, my name is John Sullivan, and this is my wife, Mary. We owe you very deep debt of gratitude and a great deal of thanks for saving our granddaughter, Susie, this afternoon. How is she?" I responded. Mrs. Sullivan answered me. "She's fine. The doctor wants to keep her overnight, though, for observation, just to be sure. Her mother, Darlene, is spending the night with her. We stopped by to thank you and to pick Hans up for her," she continued. "He was the first thing Susie asked about when we got to the hospital." Mrs. Sullivan then told me the whole story as to what happened. They were walking with him when he broke away from Susie and ran to the pool. He fell in and, as Susie went to pull him out, she fell in after him. Hans managed to scramble out just as I arrived on the scene. She said she was frantic and didn't think about anything when she thrust Hans into my arms as she left to accompany her granddaughter to the hospital. "I hope he wasn't any trouble for you," she said as she reached to take the puppy from my arms. Once they left, after thanking me profusely once more, I returned to the football game. As I sat watching, I thought to myself that I missed the little guy's company. The next day, my next shift the following day was busy. A Signal 4 accident was followed by a Signal 3 hit and run, both before 10 a.m. At 11 a.m., a Signal 72 found property resulted in recovering a lost engagement ring found on the beach. Some young lady will be very happy if she filed a lost property report and can identify the ring. Bravo 6. Signal 17. Contact the lady at 3111 Northeast 38th Avenue. 10 to 4. Dispatch. Bravo 6. 10 to 51. En route. I knew this address well. Mrs. Agnes Johnson lived there. She was a nice old widow lady in her 70s. Her husband had retired from the New York City Police Department more than 20 years ago and had recently passed away. Sometimes she got lonely and just wanted someone to talk to for a while. There was no way I was going to charge her with making nuisance calls to the police. I've tried to get her to stop calling the police, but so far, with not much luck. Pulling up in front of her house, I sensed something was not quite right. Instead of her waiting for me on the front steps, she was inside, peeking out from behind the curtains in the foyer. She opened the door and practically dragged me inside. "There's something wrong across the street," she told me. "Bill and Shirley Thompson are at work, but I saw 2 young men go into their house. They don't belong in this neighborhood. That's their car over there," she said, pointing to an old beat-up Chevy. Bravo 6 requesting 10 to 94, backup, 3112, Northeast 38th Avenue. Signal 21, burglary, in progress. I radioed dispatch. 10 to 4, Bravo 6. Dispatch answered. I instructed Mrs. Johnson to wait inside while I went over to investigate the suspected burglars' car. The keys were still in the ignition, so I removed them. Just then Charlie Drake, Bravo 12, arrived, and he went around to the back of the house. I was just walking up to the front steps when the door opened and two teenagers walked out carrying pillowcases stuffed with stolen property. "Okay, guys, put the stuff down and put your hands on top of your head," I instructed them. "Hey, Charlie," I yelled. "I've got two out front." Cuffing both of them, we searched them for anything they shouldn't have in their pockets. They both had driver's licenses identifying them as juveniles, and I suspected they were skipping school. In case you didn't know, most residential burglaries take place between the hours of 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. when people are at work. Dispatch: 10 to 15, prisoner in custody. Bravo 12 transporting 2 to juvenile detention. Also, 10 to 70, send tow truck, this location. White 78 Chevy plate RVD 116X, tow 2 in pound lot. 10 to 4, dispatch responded. As I walked back across the street, Mrs. Johnson emerged from her house and exclaimed, "Wow, that was exciting." Praising her, I said, "You did good, Mrs. Johnson, real good. You did exactly what you should have done when observing something suspicious." She beamed with pride, and I knew she would now have something to talk about with her friends for weeks. Hopefully, she wouldn't be calling the police for a while. Then I thought to myself it would be a good idea to come by and check on her a couple times a week. Just to talk. I went back to the squad car and began entering my report on my computer while waiting for the tow truck to arrive. All in all, it had been a productive day. That afternoon I had just finished changing out of my uniform into a pair of shorts and a polo shirt when my doorbell rang. I answered it and discovered the little girl from yesterday standing there holding a plate of cookies covered with plastic wrap. Right behind her stood an attractive, light-colored hair, young woman. As the little girl extended the plate of cookies, I knelt down in front of her and she announced, "My name is Susan, but you can call me Susie like all my friends do. I am 4 years old. These are for you. Mommy and I just finished making them. Mommy says I needed to come over, and thank you for pulling me out of the pool. How did you know I can't swim?" She said all in one breath. "Well, hello, Susie. My name is Rick. Thank you for the cookies. Boy, there seems to be a whole lot of them. I don't think I could possibly eat them all by myself. Would you and your mommy like to come inside and help me?" I asked. "Can we, Mommy? Can we?" She begged her mother. "Yes, sweetie, we can. You have to promise me you won't eat too many of Officer Geiger's cookies while I tell him something," she said to her daughter. I escorted them into my kitchen, poured 3 glasses of milk, and we sat at my small kitchen table. I guess I need to introduce myself. I am Darlene Sullivan, Susan's mother. I cannot begin to tell you how thankful I am for what you did yesterday. My mother called me this morning and told me I just had to ask you to come to dinner at their house this weekend. Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, whatever day works best for you. She told me to tell you no is not an option. Reaching for another cookie, Susie interjected. "Please say you will come. Grandma is such a good cook. I just know you'll like it. I accept your invitation. What choice do I have when asked by 2 pretty ladies? Saturday night works best for me," I answered, looking at Darlene. Saturday. I drove Darlene's car Saturday, after placing Susie in her car seat, along with Hans on her lap. Darlene's mom and dad lived in Rio Vista, an upscale neighborhood east of Federal Highway and a short drive from our apartments. Susie was right. Mary Sullivan was not just a good cook, she was a great one. Over dinner, I told them a little about myself and my lifelong desire to be a policeman. I was able to tell them several funny stories about some of the situations I found myself in while on duty. "Did you ever shoot someone?" Susie asked me. "Susie," Darlene exclaimed. "No, it's okay. That's a question I get asked frequently when talking with little kids." "Yes, Susie. I shot someone once," I answered. Just as quick as that topic came up, Susie changed to her next question. "Do you ever ride around in your policeman's car with the siren on? Can you take me for a ride in your policeman's car and turn the siren on? I think that would be really neat." Just then Hans ran into the room and demanded that Susie play with him. We all trooped out onto the patio to sit and watched the two of them race around the backyard. Once outside, I managed to turn the conversation around to stories about Darlene. It was getting late when we left Darlene's parents. I strapped Susie into her car seat and Darlene put Hans on her lap. We hadn't gone 2 blocks when both of them were fast asleep. As I parked Darlene's car in front of her unit, I told her what a great time I had. "Your mom and dad are really nice. I like them a lot. I had a wonderful time. Would you thank your mom again for me, please? I enjoyed the evening too," she said. "And thank you for not asking about the reason for Susie and my last name still being Sullivan. It's a sore subject with mom and dad. I thought about it, but it's none of my business. If you want to tell me, that's fine. If you don't, it's all right." It certainly is not a deal breaker for me, I replied. I still want to see more of you. I unstrapped Susie from her seat after giving the sleeping puppy to Darlene and carried the little girl inside. I'll give Hans a quick walk while you get Susie ready for bed, I told her. I'll be back in around 10 minutes. When I returned, Hans scampered into Susie's room and hopped up on the bed, snuggling close to the sleeping little girl. Since I am working the day shift, I get home about 4 in the afternoon. Would you like to go out with me Monday or Tuesday? I asked. Yes, but I'll need to find someone to watch Susie, she answered. That's not a problem. We'll take her with us. I am sure we can find a kid-friendly restaurant to visit. That was the beginning of many more dates I had with Darlene. Sometimes, when her mom wasn't able to watch Susie, we took her with us. We went to the beach a lot where I taught Susie how to swim. Sometimes we took her to Birch State Park for picnics or Holiday Park so she could run around on the playground. Truth be told, she was a remarkable little girl, and I enjoyed the times we had her accompany us. When I worked days, Darlene and I were able to see each other almost every day. When I worked the midnight shift, I was still able to meet with her for a few hours each day when she got home from work before I had to leave. The 3 to 11 shift was another story. I hardly ever got to see her other than taking her to lunch a couple times a week and on my days off. This had been the reason my previous girlfriend had broken up with me. She had wanted more of my time and didn't understand that my job and I were a package deal. Not so with Darlene. She said she was just lucky to have me in her life and accepted the shift work. One night after coming home from dinner, Darlene said to me, I want to tell you about my mistake. When I was 19 and in my first year in college, I fell in love with a guy. I thought he loved me too. He was the first and only man I ever had sex with. I got pregnant, and when I told him, I expected him to be as happy as I was with the news. The first thing he asked me was if I was sure it was his baby. When I said yes, he asked me what I was going to do about it. When I asked him what he meant, he said, well, what about an abortion? I told him there would be no abortion. I am Catholic and I don't believe in abortion. The baby didn't ask to be conceived, and I wasn't going to end his or her life. He told me that he needed some time to get his head around being a father, and he would call me the next day. When the next day came and went, without a call, I went over to his apartment and discovered he had moved out, leaving no forwarding address. Mom and Dad were not happy with the situation, but they stood by me and my decision. I never made any attempt to track him down. If he wasn't going to be there for me and his unborn child, I didn't want or need him in my life at all, ever. I went to school right up to the time Susie was born, and then I went back and finished when Susie was 1. My mom would watch her while I was in school. When I finished college, Daddy gave me a job with his investment firm. As soon as I started working and earning a paycheck, I moved into my own apartment. So there you have it. If you don't ever want to see me again, I'll understand, she whispered with tears in her eyes. My response to her was to grab her into my arms and hold her tightly and whisper back into her ear, what happened in the past stays in the past. I am only interested in the future. A future with you and Susie in it. One day, several weeks later, we took the Tri-Rail to Miami and then the Metro line out to the Metro and Dade Zoo. That was a great day. It was the first time Susie went from calling me Mr. Rick to Daddy Rick. On the way home, an elderly lady walked up to us and complimented me on my lovely family. Darlene and I looked at each other, smiled, and thanked her. That evening after Susie had gone to bed, I said to Darlene, "Sweetheart, that woman was right. We do have a lovely family, and I would like to make it official. Will you marry me?" 10 months later, Darlene and I were married, and 6 months later, Susie's adoption by me was official. For 3 years, life was wonderful, and then my world was turned upside down. 3 years later, I was working the 3 to 11 shift, and as I got ready for work, Darlene came into the bedroom as I was dressing in my uniform. I asked her why she was home from work, and she told me she had some errands to run and took the day off. "What I need you can't get at the mall," I said, pulling her against me. "I love you, sweetheart." "I know," she replied, kissing me. "I love you too, but you'll just have to wait until you get home tonight. And I have a big surprise for you." "What is it?" "It wouldn't be a surprise if I told you now. You'll just have to wait," she replied, kissing me once more. Later that evening. So far it had been a quiet day. Only a signal 2, drunk pedestrian, which I had another unit transport to jail to sober up, and a signal 51, trespassing. I issued a trespass warning to him. If he returned, he would be arrested. Around 1900 hours, 7 p.m., I decided to have something to eat. Dispatch, Bravo 6, 10 to 7, out of service, at Larry's Diner. 1900 hours. I radioed. 10 to 4, Bravo 6. Dispatch replied. As I sat eating my supper, I heard over my radio about an armed robbery and shooting with multiple victims. The address was for someplace in the 300 block of West Sunrise Boulevard. I was too far away to be called for a backup role, so I finished eating. Dispatch, Bravo 6, 10 to 8, back in service, at 1930 hours. I radioed as I returned to my squad car. 10 to 4, dispatch acknowledged. For the next hour or so, I cruised behind some of the stores and several of the strip centers in my zone looking for anything suspicious. Bravo 6, 10 to 19, return to station, 10 to 46, urgent. Dispatch radioed me. 10 to 4, 10 to 51, en route. I acknowledged. As I walked into the station 20 minutes later, I was instructed by the desk sergeant to report to Captain Wilson's office. What's this all about? I asked him. He shrugged his shoulders and told me he didn't know. All he knew was he had been instructed to tell me to go there as soon as I arrived. Taking the stairs, 2 at a time, I went to the captain's office on the 2nd floor. I found 2 other men with him in his office. One was Stan McCormick, my longtime friend. After Stan had been shot a few years ago, he had been placed on limited, light duty with the Detective Bureau. He liked it so much he transferred to the Bureau after being released from restricted duty. The other man I recognized as Father Patrick Riley, a priest at St. Anthony's Catholic Church, where Darlene and her parents have attended for many years. He married us over 3 years ago. I knew him well even though I am not a Catholic. Before any of them could speak, I knew something was terribly wrong. Stan came up to me and said, Darlene and Susie were shot earlier this evening. They walked into a store during an armed robbery. Rick, they didn't survive. I am so very sorry. It felt as if something just sucked all the air from my lungs. I fell into a chair, not quite comprehending the enormity of it all. My wife and my daughter gone in a senseless act of violence. After several minutes of complete silence, I whispered, I have to call Mom and Dad. Taking out my cell phone, I made the call. Mom answered on the 2nd ring. Mom, it's me, Darlene and Susie. I couldn't finish and handed the phone to Stan. Mrs. Geiger, this is Stan McCormick. I have horrible news. Darlene and Susie were killed earlier this evening. There was a pause while Stan listened to something Mom said. Then he continued. Hello, Mr. Geiger. I am so very sorry to have to break such bad news to you. Rick is too choked up to talk just now. Long pause. Yes, sir, I'll tell him. Handing the phone back to me, he said, Rick, your dad wants to talk to you. Just listen. He understands how you feel right now. I listened to my dad tell me he would contact my sister, and he and Mom would leave immediately. All I could do was whisper to him, thanks, Pop. We sat in the office for quite some time as Captain Wilson, Father Riley, and Stan tried to comfort me. Finally, I asked if Darlene's parents had been notified. Not yet, Rick. Stan replied. I need to do it. Father Riley, will you come with me? I asked. You're not in any condition to drive, Rick. I'll drive you, and the father there, Stan told me. We went out to the parking lot, and before getting into Stan's car, I gave him my gun belt and radio to lock in the trunk. 10 minutes later, we pulled up in front of John and Mary Sullivan's home. As late as it was, the lights were still on in the house. Knocking on the front door, I was met by John Sullivan. The next 2 hours were the most emotionally charged moments of my life. John and Mary clutched each other as I held them both in my arms, with all 3 of us crying with grief. Father Riley managed to calm us down and begin the long process of healing. Sometime later, I asked Stan to take me home. I needed to look after Susie's dog, Hans. Don't worry, it's not necessary, as he explained that his wife, Kathy, had picked Hans up earlier and the dog was now with her. Thanks, buddy. I told him. Why don't you go home? I'll be all right. No, Rick. I am staying right here with all of you, was his reply. With that, he went into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. The rest of the night was spent trying to come to some understanding of the tragedy. At 6:30 the next morning, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I answered it. It was Dad. My sister Beth's husband, Pete, had rented a plane and flew the family from Pensacola to Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport. They were on the way to my house. I woke Stan, who had fallen asleep in one of the living room chairs, and asked him to drive me home. I explained to John and Mary that my parents had arrived and were now on their way to my place. I would see them later. Father Riley said he would stay with them. We arrived at my place a few minutes before Mom, Dad, and the family arrived, and the same emotional scene as the night before was repeated. After everything had settled down, we moved Mom and Dad's suitcases into the guest bedroom. Pete, Beth, and their 2 girls would occupy the other 2 bedrooms. Later that afternoon, Dad and John Sullivan went with me to the funeral home to make arrangements for Darlene and Susie. The funeral director told me they would transport the remains to the funeral home as soon as the medical examiner released the bodies. I selected 2 caskets for them. I was able to purchase 2 burial plots in the historic Evergreen Cemetery located close to the Rio Vista neighborhood where John and Mary Sullivan lived. When we arrived back at the house, Stan and Kathy were there. They brought Hans with them, and he was busy getting to know my two nieces. Every so often he went into Susie's room, sniffed, and looked around before returning to his two new friends. The following morning the phone rang and Mom answered it, and then told me the funeral director would be stopping by for some last-minute instructions. 20 minutes he arrived, and we all sat down in the living room. "Mr. Geiger," he began, "the arrangements for your wife and daughter are complete. However, I would like to know your decision about your unborn child." "Unborn child?" I stammered, stunned with this news. "What unborn child?" "Oh, I am so sorry. I wasn't aware you didn't know your wife was pregnant. The medical examiner discovered a male fetus, approximately 3-month-old during the autopsy. What are your wishes concerning him?" That was the surprise she was going to tell me about the other night. Oh my God. I cried to Mom and Dad. Several moments later, after regaining my composure, I said, "I think the child should remain with his mother. Is that a problem?" "No, sir, it is not," he stated emphatically. "We will do anything you wish. I am so sorry to have had to bring you this news." The next few days remain a blur in my memory. The funeral mass at St. Anthony's was so well attended there wasn't an empty seat in the church. People were standing in the back as well as outside. Father Riley conducted the service at the church as well as at graveside. So many of our friends and co-workers came by afterwards to express their sympathy that I lost track of all of them. A few days later, Mom, Mary Sullivan, Beth and Stan's wife Kathy helped me in removing Darlene and Susie's things from the house. All of Darlene's clothes were donated to various women's groups. Susie clothes went to children relief organizations. Darlene's jewelry I gave to the women and my nieces. The only things I kept were all the photo albums and Darlene's engagement and wedding rings, which I placed in my safe deposit box. Before Pete, Beth and the girls left for home, I spoke with both of them. I wanted to be sure they were okay with what I had in mind. Hans needed children in his life, and I wanted him to be in safe and loving home. "Girls," I asked my nieces, "would you like to take Hans home with you? You have to promise me you will love him and take good care of him." They both rushed over to me, hugged me and promised they would love him forever. Even Hans barked his approval. The 5 of them left later that day to fly back home. Mom and Dad had decided to stay with me for a few more days and then would fly back home commercial. 4 days after the funeral, I called Stan this morning and asked him for an update on the investigation into my wife and daughter's murder. He asked me to come down to the station after 10 a.m. Stan had been tapped to lead a team tasked with investigating the murder and robbery. I wanted Dad to come with me. When we arrived, Stan led us into his little office. "I have some good news and some bad news," he said. "First, the good news." He went on to explain that the convenience store had recently installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system. 5 digital cameras recorded everything to a computer hard drive. Microphones also sent sound to the hard drive. The computer automatically burned a DVD every 2 hours. No more fuzzy or grainy videotapes. Using facial recognition software, along with fingerprints, our techs were able to identify the killer. His name was Leroy Washington, and he had an extensive record, including a 7-year stretch in state prison for robbery. "I would like to see the video," I asked Stan. "Rick, I watched the video. It's brutal. Just watching it made me sick to my stomach, and every one of my men had the same reaction after viewing it. Your emotions are still pretty raw, so don't watch it right now. I'll tell you what's on it," he replied. He continued. Washington entered the store with a gun. He demanded that the clerk open the register, and after she complied, he shot her twice and grabbed the money. Darlene and Susie entered just as he killed the clerk. He shot both of them. Before he left, he stood over them and fired twice more into the back of their heads. Now the bad news. We haven't been able to find him. We've questioned every one of our CIS, confidential informants, with no luck. A bolo, be on the lookout for, has been sent out across the entire southeastern U.S. A $10,000 reward for information leading to his arrest has garnered hundreds of leads every day. It's taking a lot of time and manpower following up on each one of them. I wish I could say that we are close to an arrest, but I can't. I witnessed the distress on Stan's face as he told me all this. He was near to tears with frustration. "I understand," I told him as we were leaving. "I know you are doing everything you can. Just keep me in the loop if anything breaks." 5 days later, I went back to work after dropping Mom and Dad off at Fort Lauderdale International Airport for their flight back to Pensacola. I was still on the 3 to 11 shift, but would rotate to midnights in a week. It was hard coming home to an empty house each night, and I was having difficulty falling asleep. All I could think of was how short a time Darlene and I had together. After a couple of sleepless nights, I began staying at the station and helping the night shift detectives sort through the hundreds of leads that came in each day. I only managed to get a few hours sleep when I got back home in the early morning hours. When I went on midnights, I would stay until early afternoon helping out before going home. 10 weeks later, weeks went by without any success. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed this guy. Finally, I was becoming worn out working what amounted to 2 consecutive shifts every day. Stan had been after me to slow down, but I kept putting him off. Then one afternoon, Captain Wilson cornered me. "Rick, you look like death warmed over. When was the last time you got a full night's sleep? Your uniform is hanging off you. Just how much weight have you lost?" The captain asked me. "When you get overworked and tired, you make mistakes, and if you make a mistake in our business, it could get you killed. So, I have contacted personnel and arranged for you to take a week's leave. There will be no argument. As of today, you're on vacation. You are not to set one foot in the station. Do I make myself clear? I called your dad. He is expecting you to visit." I knew he was right and had my best interest at heart. Captain Wilson was like a second father to me. He and my dad went back a long ways. Dad had actually broke him in when he was a rookie just out of the academy 25 years ago. I knew what he said was true, so all I could say was, "Yes, sir." I stayed with Mom and Dad. They had a 2-bedroom condo on Pensacola Beach. Pete, Beth's husband, managed to take a few days off and took us fishing on his boat out in the Gulf. I actually caught a few grouper which we grilled at his house for dinner that evening. Mom, Beth, and my 2 nieces fussed over me. Watching the girls play with Hans reminded me of how Susie used to play with him. Surprisingly, I could look back to those memories without becoming too depressed. When I left them, to make the 10-hour drive back home, I was in much better shape, physically and emotionally. Returning to work, I went by Captain Wilson's office and thanked him for everything he did for me. I still stuck my head into the detective bureau every so often and helped sort through the leads. Those that had a chance of panning out I sent along to the team. Other leads hit the round file. Some of them were off the wall. One guy said he saw Washington get into a flying saucer and blast off for another planet. Another said he witnessed Washington transform into a 3-headed monster and walk out into the Everglades. Then the leads began to slow from 100 a day to only 3 or 4. So I increased the reward from $10,000 to $50,000. I could afford it. Darlene had been the expert in financial planning at her dad's firm. She used her talents to ensure our future. She had taken out a $500,000 double indemnity term life policy for each of us. Susie had a $200,000 whole life policy. That, coupled with other investments, left me with a little over $1.5 million when everything was settled. Truth be told, I would have exchanged every last dime of it to have my wife and daughter back. The additional reward money resulted in a few hundred more tips as to the location of Leroy, Washington. Unfortunately, these were dead ends as well. One evening, I was invited over to John and Mary's home for dinner. Afterwards, while Mary was busy in the kitchen, I asked John for some advice on what to do with the money I now had. He recommended that I pay off the home mortgage and any other outstanding loans. The remainder should be invested. When I told him that I knew just the firm with which to do that, he just smiled. Mary returned to the dining room table with coffee and dessert and said to me, "Rick, John and I want to talk to you. It has been almost a year now since Darlene and Susie died. It's time for you to move on. You are still a young man. You need to make a new life for yourself." 8 months later, I just had gotten home from working a 3 to 11 shift. After grabbing something to drink from the fridge, I sat down and watched ESPN for an hour before heading to bed. The ringing of the phone on my night table woke me from a deep sleep. Looking at the clock, as I picked up the phone, I wondered who in the hell was calling me at 3:30 in the morning. "Rick, it's Stan. We found him. We're going to make an arrest in about an hour. Do you want to be in on it?" "Are you kidding? Do I want to be in on it? I'll meet you at the station in 20 minutes. I replied. 25 minutes later, Stan, 10 other guys, and me were headed out. On the way over, Stan gave me a quick rundown on what happened. A little after 2 this morning, a guy came into the station and asked the desk sergeant if we were still looking for Leroy, Washington. He took the guy upstairs to the bureau office, and they immediately called me at home. When I got there, Charlie Taggart had him repeat what he had already told him. Stan explained. He continued telling me that the guy had been out in a bar and saw Washington drinking by himself. He knew him from playing hoops at the park with him a couple of years ago. He went over, said hello, and they talked until the place closed at 2. Washington asked for a ride home, so this fellow gave him one. "That's how we know where he is staying," Stan said as we pulled to a stop just down the street from a duplex north of 6th Street on 31st Avenue. At 4:40 a.m. we kicked in the front door and, turning on the lights in the bedroom, found Washington still in bed. An empty whiskey bottle was laying on the floor next to him. He had probably passed out and never heard us enter. Handing me a pair of handcuffs, Stan said, "You cuff him." With pleasure, I replied through gritted teeth. What I really wanted to do is take my 9mm and put a couple of rounds into his sorry, but I realized that would make me as bad as him. It would be best for the legal system to run its course. Leroy Washington, you are under arrest for armed robbery and murder. I then read him his Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to us? He mumbled, no. Stan and I removed him from the house and took him back to the station. 5 other detectives remained and searched the duplex apartment. They found a gun, a couple boxes of ammunition, and $100 in small bills. Stan and I were both there when he was arraigned at 9 that morning. Standing with his court-appointed attorney, Washington was formally charged with 3 counts of capital murder, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. No bail, and he was remanded to the county jail until trial. He left the courtroom the same way he entered, escorted by 2 very large sheriff's deputies handcuffed and in shackles. There was some degree of satisfaction in seeing this unfold. I went by John Sullivan's office and was able to give him some good news. We had Darlene and Susie's killer locked up. He was relieved to hear this and immediately called Mary and told her. Now all we could do was wait for his trial. In Florida, there is the 180-day speedy trial law. That means an accused person has to be brought to trial in that time frame. Once the trial date has been set, both the prosecution and defense can ask for continuances. However, if the prosecution goes beyond the 180-day rule, the defendant can be set free. The defense not bound by this stipulation. Once Washington's defense team learned that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty, they tried every legal trick to delay his trial. Finally, after the 3rd continuance expired, the judge ordered them to be prepared for trial in 10 days. There would be no more continuances granted. In spite of the high-priced anti-death penalty attorney brought in from Miami, the trial was a slam dunk for the prosecution. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all 5 counts. On the count of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, the judge sentenced him to 10 years. On the armed robbery charge, he got 20 years. Both sentences to run concurrently. The judge then reconvened the jury a week later to determine the penalty for the 3 murders. After 6 days of testimony for any extenuating circumstances, the court was adjourned for the jury to deliberate Washington's fate. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, court was reconvened. The jury had reached a decision. The defendant was instructed to rise while the jury foreman read the decision. The foreman, a 30-something male, began reading. As to the first count of murder in the first degree of Judith Coates, the jury recommends death. To the second count of murder in the first degree of Darlene Geiger, the jury recommends death. To the final count of murder in the first degree of Susan Geiger, the jury recommends death. So say we all. He finished, sitting back down in his seat. Does the defendant wish to make any statement before I pass judgment? The judge questioned Washington. He shook his head and said no. The judge then continued, and after recounting the heinous nature of the crimes, he said, "It is the sentence of this court that Leroy Carver Washington be executed at a time and place to be determined by the state of Florida in accordance with the verdict of a jury of your peers. God have mercy on your soul." After thanking the jury for their service, he dismissed them and adjourned court. As Washington was being led away, shackled and in handcuffs, I said just loud enough for him to hear, "I'll be there to watch when they stick that needle in your arm, ending your miserable life." John and Mary Sullivan, my mom and dad, Stan and his wife, along with several members of the police department, were with me when the sentence was handed down. It was over. Almost 11 months since the murder of my wife and little girl, and justice had finally prevailed. Out in the hallway from the courtroom, the jury foreman came up to me and shook my hand. "In case you were wondering why it took so long for us to reach a decision," he said, "we had our decision within 5 minutes of getting back to the jury room. We didn't want to chance our decision being overturned on appeal for lack of due deliberation, and that's why we took so long." The Coates family was also in the hallway, and I walked over to tell them what the foreman had said to me. I had come to know them quite well over the preceding months. Mrs. Coates, a single mother, had been working a second job at the convenience store in order to save enough money for her 2 children to go to college. Both her son and daughter were good students in school, and even with financial aid would not have been able to attend the university in Gainesville without her working that extra job. John and I looked into their background, and we decided to fully fund both of their college educations. It helped us knowing something good would come out of this tragedy. After leaving the courthouse, I drove to the cemetery. Standing in front of Darlene and Susie's graves, I told them how much I loved and missed them. The man who had taken them from me had been captured, tried, and convicted. They could rest in peace knowing I would always remember them. I had been coming to Denny's for breakfast since I went on midnights 2 months ago. I was easier to stop for breakfast there than going home and fixing something. Since I had the next 2 days off, I decided to run some errands instead of going home and going to bed after eating. The place was unusually packed this morning, and since tomorrow was my day off, I really was in no rush to be seated. I watched as a young woman, who was waiting ahead of me, was escorted by the hostess to a table. When the hostess returned, she came up to me and said that the woman told her to ask if I would like to share the table with her as the restaurant was so crowded. I agreed, and grabbing another menu, she led the way. Sitting down, I thanked the young woman for offering to share her table with me. She was pretty. No, make that beautiful, with dark brown hair and deep blue eyes. You probably don't remember me, do you? She asked. When I acknowledged that I didn't, she continued speaking. My name is Rebecca Dickerson, and I remember you. You saved my life over 8 years ago when you shot that man who was trying to assault and kill me. I told you then that I would never forget you. When I read about your wife and daughter being killed, I was horrified. Why do bad things happen to good people? I don't know. Anyway, I came to their funeral at St. Anthony's. I saw how distraught and sad you were, and I just wanted to run up, put my arms around you and tell you that everything would be okay, just like you did for me. I read in the paper a while ago that the man who killed them was tried, convicted, and got the death sentence. I'm glad of that. He deserves it. You have been in my thoughts and my prayers every day for all these years, and I am so happy to finally get to meet and talk with you again. By the way, how is your mom? I managed to interject. Mom died 2 years ago, she sadly answered. For quite a while after that incident, she was afraid to go out with anyone. Did you know that she had gone out with that guy several times? He seemed nice enough in the beginning, but then he started suggesting weird things to her. That's when she broke it off and told him not to come around anymore. You saw how well that worked. She told me. Anyway, she finally met a really nice guy. They got married 6 years ago. He treated her like a queen, and I really liked him. They moved up to a retirement community south of Ocala 4 years ago. There was nothing for me there, so I decided to stay here and go to school. She continued. Mom would call me every Sunday evening. One Sunday when she called, she sounded terrible. There was a flu bug going around, and she must have caught it, is what she said. I asked her if she had gone to the doctor, and as usual, she had put it off. I made her promise to go the next day. The following morning around 10, my cell phone rang. It was Bill, her husband. He told me that Mom had gotten really sick in the middle of the night, and he had rushed her to the emergency room. It was too late. She died shortly after arriving. So when I finished my bachelor's degree in elementary education, I got a job with the school district here in Broward County. Today is a school holiday, so I decided to treat myself to breakfast this morning. Saying that, she put her hand on my forearm and said, "And I am really glad I did." I am too, I echoed. Walking out of the restaurant an hour later, we were met with a torrential downpour typical in South Florida during the rainy season. Oh darn, I didn't bring an umbrella with me, she exclaimed. Looks like I am going to get soaked waiting for the bus. Not wanting the morning to end, I said, I'll give you a ride. Wait here while I run and get my car. No, that's too much trouble for you. I'll just wait here until it lets up. I was going to take the bus and run some errands and go shopping at the mall. She answered. Hey, it's no trouble at all. I need to pick a few things at the mall myself. If you don't mind coming home with me for a few minutes, while I change out of my uniform, we can go together. I replied. Okay, if you are sure it won't be any trouble, I would love that, she said. After finishing running all our errands and shopping, we stopped for a late lunch before I took Rebecca home. When she gave me her address, I recognized it as one I had been to before. The place was well known for drugs, gambling, and trade. When I voiced my concerns, she told me she was aware of it. This place was the only one she could afford close to the bus stops and the school at which she worked. Paying off my college loans doesn't leave much left over for a better place to live. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and as we walked up the outside staircase, I asked why she didn't use the elevator. Her reply was that it was too dangerous. You never know who's going to get on with you. It's just safer for me to climb the stairs. Walking down the corridor to her apartment, I noticed half the hallway lights were off and it was semi-dark. As we approached the door to her apartment, I stopped her. The door to her apartment was partially opened with fresh marks on it, where someone had pried the door lock to gain entry. I could hear noises inside. Stepping back, I told her to dial 911. Tell them there is a burglary in progress. Give them your name and address. Tell them that Officer Rick Geiger is inside your apartment and he is armed and needs assistance. Removing my weapon from its holster strapped to my left calf, I went inside. I surprised 2 men rifling through Rebecca's belongings. Police, I shouted. Do not turn around. Put your hands on top of your head and interlace your fingers. When they complied, I then said, now slowly go down on your knees. Make any sudden moves and, believe me, I will shoot you. A couple of minutes later, I heard a voice from the hallway. Geiger, where are you? Back bedroom. I have two down on their knees. I shouted back. Meanwhile, Rebecca. I did exactly as Rick instructed. I called 911, gave them my name and address and what Rick told me to say. The operator told me to stay on the line and that help was on the way. I heard yelling from inside my apartment but couldn't make out what was being said. When I relayed this to the 911 operator, she told me the police were in the parking lot and were on the way up the stairs. I saw two officers emerge from the stairs at the end of the corridor. They saw me and ran to my apartment and went inside. A couple of minutes later, they came out with two men, who I recognized as living downstairs, both in handcuffs. Rick followed them out. Coming over to me, he took my hand and led me back into my apartment. I was absolutely horrified at the damage those two men had done. Everything I owned was scattered about. The contents from the drawers of my dresser had been dumped on the floor. Stacked next to the front door was my school-issued laptop, my mother's jewelry box, along with my small flat-screen TV and DVD player. I couldn't help but to start crying. I fell heavily onto the sofa and Rick sat beside me. Putting his arm around me and pulling me close, he said, "You'll be okay. It's over now. They won't be back. But you can't stay here tonight. Where can I go?" I cried. My friend Susan is in the Keys with her fiancé, or I would be able to stay with her. I haven't any money for a motel, even if I could find one. We'll gather up your things, and you will stay at my house tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something, he said to me. When I told Rebecca that she would be staying the night after with me that fateful day, little did I realize that when I said that we would think of something, that something would be her moving in with me permanently. So when we couldn't find an apartment she could afford or one of which I would approve, I suggested she move permanently into the guest bedroom. She agreed with the stipulation she would pay me rent. After some argument, I agreed. So once a month she paid me $500, and I simply put it into an investment fund in her name without telling her. She was a joy to have around. I no longer was allowed to do any house cleaning or do any of the cooking. That was great because my idea of a gourmet dinner was a frozen burrito from the microwave. She was always there to greet me when I came home, no matter what shift I worked. It wasn't too much longer that we started going out in the evenings on my days off. Rebecca soon went from being a roommate to being my girlfriend. I soon fell in love with this beautiful, charming, and articulate young woman. Bravo 6, 10 to 50, stopping vehicle, 10 to 28, check registration, tag Alpha, Charlie, Hotel 3379. I radioed dispatch. The driver had pulled to the side of the road just as soon as I lit him up with my blue lights. I pulled in back, slightly to the left of his stopped car to protect him from passing traffic. As I approached the car, I saw a young man in the uniform of a U.S. Marine. As he handed me his driver's license, I said to him, "I pulled you over for exceeding the posted speed limit of 45 miles per hour. I clocked you in excess of 60 miles per hour. I am sorry. I have no excuse for speeding, officer. I just returned home from being deployed in Afghanistan for a year. I am on my way home to see my wife and baby girl. I haven't seen her since she was born. I guess my mind wasn't on my driving." Taking his license and some paperwork for the rental car from him, I walked back to my patrol car and ran the license through DMV. It came up clean. Dispatch confirmed the rental car registration. Here was a young man who had made a sacrifice in his life to do what was right for his country. There was no way I was going to give him a speeding ticket. "Corporal Samuels," I said to him after handing him license and paperwork, "slow down. You wouldn't want to have an accident after all you have been through for the past year. Your wife and baby need you home safe and sound. Remember, slow down and pay attention to your driving. Go home. Be safe. Have a great reunion with your family. Thank you for your service." After thanking me and promising to obey the speed limits, he left. As I was walking back to leave the scene, a speeding car side swiped my patrol car and then struck me. It was the last thing I remembered until I woke up in the hospital. I had listed Stan as my emergency contact in addition to my parents. He was contacted and, since he was aware of my relationship with Rebecca, called her. Regaining consciousness and becoming aware of my surroundings, I found her sitting beside me, holding my hand and with her head laying on the bed next to my chest. "What happened?" I asked. Stan, who had been sitting on the other side of my bed, answered. "Drunk driver who didn't obey the move-over law, hit your patrol car and then you. Rick, you were really lucky. You went over the top of his car and not under it. You've got a broken left ankle and a severe concussion. The doctor will fill you in on the particulars later." Rebecca then said, I was so worried about you when Stan called. I couldn't imagine what my life would be like without you in it. I love you. I have always loved you. You are going to be okay. We will get through this together," she said with tears streaming down her cheeks. The doctor came in and checked me over and then announced that I would be released the next day providing I had someone to stay with me, just in case. "That's not a problem, doctor," Rebecca told him. Rebecca drove us home the next morning. Helping me with my crutches, we went inside. I had just sat down when the phone rang. It was my mother. Rebecca spoke with her for a few minutes before handing the phone to me. After assuring and reassuring my mom again that I was all right and she didn't have to drive down to take care of me, I handed the phone back to Rebecca. She spoke with my mom and told her everything the doctor had said, that all I needed was to rest and stay off my ankle for a while. Everything would be fine, but she would call each day with an update on my condition. Mom must have said something because Rebecca giggled and answered, "Yes, I know. Don't worry, I'll take good care of him." After lunch, I said that I wanted to go to my bedroom. I couldn't take any painkillers because of the concussion, but I needed to lie down for a while. She helped me into the bedroom, and as she hung my shirt up in the closet, I saw she had moved some of her clothes into my closet. "I think I need to sleep in here with you in case you need something during the night," she explained. I recovered some weeks later and went back to work. She never moved back into the other bedroom, and I was all too happy to have her share my bed. In April, during Rebecca's spring break from school, I decided to take some time off and we would visit my folks in Pensacola. Even though they knew all about Rebecca and how much she meant to me, they had never met face to face. Oh, to be sure, my mom and Rebecca had talked on the phone numerous times. Even after my recovery, it still would be the first time actually seeing one another. We arrived late in the afternoon after a long, but pleasant, drive. Rebecca was a big hit with both Mom and Dad. Mom said Rebecca could have the second bedroom and I could sleep on the sofa in the living room or go to my sister's house. I told my mom that it wouldn't be necessary. Rebecca and I had been sharing a bedroom ever since my accident. When I said that, Mom stuttered, "Oh my, okay." Dad just winked at me, grinned and asked when was the wedding going to be. "Just as soon as possible after he asks me." Rebecca replied to my dad, "Well, I was going to wait until tomorrow, but now is as good a time as ever." Producing a ring box from my pocket, I got down on one knee in front of her. "Rebecca Dickerson, I love you deeply. You mean the world to me. Will you marry me?" I managed to stammer. In case you were wondering, the ring I gave her was not the one from my safety deposit box. Before I could regain my feet, Rebecca dropped to her knees and throwing her arms around me said, "Yes, yes." After we both regained our feet and Mom had managed to recover enough to hug her, and then me saying, "We have to call Beth right now and share this news with her and Pete." Dad shook my hand, patted me on the back, and congratulating us said to Rebecca, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart." 20 minutes later, Beth, Pete, and the two girls showed up. Pete had brought a couple of bottles of champagne with which to celebrate our engagement, and we did celebrate long into the night. One evening shortly after we returned to Fort Lauderdale, we went out to dinner at the Sea Watch restaurant overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. We had just been seated when John and Mary Sullivan walked in. I pointed them out to Rebecca and told her who they were and what they meant to me. She insisted that I get up and ask them to join us for dinner. When I brought them to our table, Rebecca stood as I introduced them. She hugged each of them. We had a thoroughly enjoyable evening. Telling them about our plans to be married was met with enthusiastic congratulations. Both Mary and John wanted to know all the details of the upcoming event. As we left the restaurant and said our goodbyes, I saw Rebecca whisper into Mary's ear, and Mary whispered something back to Rebecca. Some months later, Mary told me what the two of them had said to each other. It didn't surprise me. Rebecca had a way about her that made everyone love her. She and Mary became the best of friends. Mary soon began to think of Rebecca as a second daughter. We were married in late June. Stan was my best man and my sister, Beth, was the matron of honor. Pete and one of my friends from the police department, as well as Stan's wife, Kathy, and one of Rebecca's colleagues from school rounded out the wedding party. Rebecca had insisted that John and Mary sit in the place of honor on the bride's side of the church. I thought it might be awkward for them, but they both assured me that they were honored by Rebecca's request. After a short honeymoon, we returned home and I went back to work. 2 months later, Rebecca returned to her teaching job at an elementary school much closer to our home. Early one Saturday morning in October, the bedside phone rang. Rebecca answered it, and rolling over to me, she gave me the handset. "It's Stan. He wants to talk to you." Glancing at the clock on my night table, I saw it was only 6:30 a.m. "Hey Stan, what's so important that you had to call at such an ungodly hour?" I asked. "Thought you might want to know Leroy Washington is dead. He was stabbed to death by another inmate on death row last night." Evidently, he said something that pissed off the wrong guy and got a shank shoved into his chest. This news didn't bring any satisfaction to me, but it did bring some sense of final closure. Thanks, Stan. I appreciate the heads up. When I told Rebecca the news, she hugged me, and all she said was, "I hope he rots in hell." 1 year later, it was a little past 3 a.m. when I finally got home from my 3 to 11 shift. A tanker truck had overturned coming out of Port Everglades at the intersection of State Road 84 and South Federal Highway, spilling several hundred gallons of diesel fuel just after 9 in the evening. As the junior road patrol sergeant, I had been promoted a few months ago. It fell to me to stay on scene until the hazmat team and fire department cleaned it up so we could reopen the intersection. Being as quiet as I could, I locked my weapons in the gun safe in the closet, and after undressing, I slid into bed. "What time is it?" a sleepy voice asked me. "I tried to stay awake after you called, but I just couldn't." "That's okay. It's after 3. Go back to sleep, sweetheart. You need your rest," I answered. Snuggling up to me, with her arm over my chest, she whispered in my ear, "The babies knows when you're not here. They have been restless all night. They have just now settled down when you got into bed. It won't be too much longer, honey." I whispered back, "It's just a matter of a few weeks now." She was soon sound fast asleep, and, before I drifted off, I thought back to the day she told me I was going to become a daddy. It was a Sunday. We had come home from church, and after a light lunch, we sat together on the patio enjoying the afternoon. "I am going to go inside and get a beer. Can I get you a glass of wine, honey?" I asked. "No, thank you, but a glass of iced tea would be great," she replied. "Sure thing. I'll be right back," I said, getting up from my seat. When I returned, I placed the glasses on a small table between us and sat back down. "Rick, I've something to tell you." Smiling sweetly, she got up from her chair and sat in my lap. "I won't be drinking any alcohol for a while. You're going to be a daddy. My home pregnancy test strip showed positive this morning. I am making an appointment tomorrow with the doctor to confirm it." The following week, it was confirmed. We were having a baby. I was over the wall happy. We decided not to tell anyone, just in case, until she started showing. 3 months later, when I got home from work, Rebecca handed me a double scotch on the rocks and told me I needed to sit down. I went in for my checkup this morning, and the doctor ran some tests. "Brace yourself, Rick. We're not having a baby. We are having 2 babies, twins." The doctor was unable to determine the sex yet. "We'll have to wait at least another month for that, or we could wait and be surprised." I elected to find out as soon as possible. I wanted to start working on turning one of the bedrooms into a nursery, and I needed to know blue or pink paint for the walls. Then we could start buying appropriate furniture and clothing for the twins. 6 weeks later, I found out I would be converting another of the bedrooms. One would be pink and the other blue. It was really fun doing the work. Rebecca helped me a lot until she was too far along in her pregnancy, and I refused to allow her to do any more work. Just as I drifted off to sleep, cuddled up to Rebecca, I thought to myself, now comes the hard part, the waiting. 10 days later, Rebecca and I were the proud parents of twins, 1 boy and 1 girl. We named our son Frederick Carl Geiger, after my father, and our daughter, Christine Mary Geiger. Stan and Kathy McCormick were named godparents for our son, and Beth and Pete were the godparents for our little girl. My mom and dad were thrilled to now have 4 grandchildren. Mary Sullivan fell in love with both of our babies, and she and John soon became adopted grandparents. I think often of Darlene and Susie, but somehow I believe that they both have become the twins' guardian angels and gives me comfort. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.